My name is Mary Rose Martinez. I'm a program manager for the Philadelphia Energy Authority. And welcome to the fourth day of the second annual Philadelphia Solar Week. This week, we're celebrating the successes and talking to residents and businesses across the city about how to go solar. And today's webinar is going to feature case studies on 3 commercial solar projects that are either recently completed or in progress in different parts of the city, serving different purposes. For those of you who've been able to join throughout the week, you know that we've covered a lot of ground. On Monday, we had Councilmember Kathy Gilmore Richardson and a homeowner talking about going solar during COVID. On Tuesday, we had Council President Clark and SIA, among others, talk about the role that solar plays in economic development and creating local living wage jobs. Yesterday, we had a great conversation talking about utility scale models and growth on that front. And today, we've got a great panel for you. First, we'll be hearing from Councilmember Green, and then we'll hear about 3 recently completed or in progress projects that I mentioned before. We'll give you kind of a range of the work that's happening here in Philadelphia on the commercial solar front, and hopefully it'll inspire some business owners on the call to think about how solar works for them. So before we get started, I'd like to just give a brief overview of the Philadelphia Energy Authority. You can go to the next slide, please. So the Philadelphia Energy Authority is an independent municipal authority created by City Council in 2010. We have the goal to support and grow the clean and green economy here in the city. And if you turn to the next slide, you see that really at the core of the Philadelphia Energy Authority's work is this idea that energy can be a tool for impact. As such, we have a 10-year energy campaign launched in 2016 to spur the deployment of $1 billion of capital and create 10,000 jobs throughout the city by 2026. We're happy to announce we've invested over $130 million in energy efficiency and clean energy projects already. And some of those projects you're going to hear a little bit more about today. First up, I'd like to actually hand over the webinar to Councilmember Green. Councilmember Derek Green was elected as a member of City Council in Philadelphia in 2015. He serves as the chair of the Committees on Finance and Disabilities. He's also a board of director for the National League of Cities, a regional director for the National Black Caucus of Local Elected Officials, and the first vice president for the Pennsylvania Municipal League, among many other positions. A lawyer by training, Councilmember Green previously served as the assistant district attorney in Philadelphia, and he's been a staunch advocate of growing the green and clean economy, particularly solar here. I'd like to turn it over to him now to talk more about that.
Well, thank you, Mary Rose. It's a pleasure to be here for the second annual Philadelphia Solar Week, in particular for this webinar, solar and showing how it's good for business and showing some of the trailblazing commercial projects. It's a pleasure to be here. It's also a blessing to see how the Philadelphia Energy Authority has really grown over the past number of years. Back it was started in 2010, and to see where we are now as an organization and really the impact the Energy Authority has had not only in the city of Philadelphia, but the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. When you think before the creation of the Energy Authority, Pennsylvania and Philadelphia really was not that well known for being versed in solar projects. And through the work of the Energy Authority and having these events like this Solar Week, Solarize Philly, which has really provided an opportunity to bring the opportunities for solar installation, solar energy to so many homes in the city of Philadelphia. And now more recently, as we've started to really grow in the commercial space, I was really blessed to really work with the Energy Authority as we were able to pass legislation last year regarding CPACE. And just a few weeks ago, we had our first CPACE project here in the city of Philadelphia. And I think that's really going to continue to grow. And I remember after the legislation was passed and we had the bill signing, the Energy Authority had a kind of meet and greet reception about CPACE to really see how people would react to this new opportunity here in Philadelphia. And the room was overflowing. There was a number of people from a lot of different perspectives looking at how CPACE can help their project and also help their commercial building. And coming out of that gathering, we now have our first CPACE project here in the city of Philadelphia, and that will just continue to grow. We'll see additional opportunities as we're now going into 2020 and soon be into 2021. Hopefully we can look at other opportunities for CPACE projects, especially on the residential side. And I think this really shows the growth of the Energy Authority and also the leadership of the Energy Authority in moving solar as a really outstanding opportunity for energy in the city of Philadelphia, not only on the residential side, but also the commercial side. So when you talk about energy as a tool for impact, that's truly what's happening here in our city, in our Commonwealth. And the Energy Authority is really leading the way to provide those opportunities for those residents and also commercial property owners. And I just can't wait to see the additional work that the Energy Authority will do going forward, and we really make an impact for all of the constituents in the city of Philadelphia, both residents and also commercial opportunities and projects.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Council Member. Those were wonderful remarks, and we're so appreciative of all of your support too.
Absolutely.
Next, I'd like to turn over the mic to Eric, the Director of Sustainability and Business Innovation at SEPTA. For the out-of-towners who are on the call, SEPTA is Philadelphia and Southeast Pennsylvania's mass transit system, and they're tackling renewable energy and resilience from a number of creative angles using solar. Eric has been at SEPTA for 5 years, and he oversees the business transformation and performance management initiatives there, including the agency's award-winning sustainability program, SEPTainable, which he's here to talk to you about today. So Eric, take it away.
Thank you, and good morning. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, I'm going to provide a little bit of context on SEPTA's sustainability program, and then I'm going to provide significant detail on 3 ongoing solar initiatives that we have as part of that program. Next slide. So our sustainability program has been going since 2011. It was adopted by our board as part of our strategic business plan. And we've won a number of awards over the last 10 years. One of the ones that we're most proud of was the Governor's Award for Environmental Excellence a couple years ago, which sort of encapsulated the series of initiatives that I'm going to talk to you about today. Next slide. So we take a triple bottom line approach to sustainability at SEPTA. We look at initiatives that benefit the environment, but also communities and also the economy. And the solar initiatives definitely do all 3. We talk about them in terms of natural environment and the way we categorize them in our plan. And in our plan, we have 5 goals for natural environment: to reduce greenhouse gases, to reduce energy use, to reduce water use, to better manage stormwater, largely in partnership with the City of Philadelphia and the Water Department's Green Cities Initiative, and to better manage waste and recycling. Next slide. Our greenhouse gas goal is where our solar initiatives live, and we track our greenhouse gases based on 2 different factors. We look at our gross greenhouse gas emissions, and we track that based on pounds of carbon dioxide equivalents. And over the course of the last 12 years, which is as long as we've been tracking the data, we've reduced our greenhouse gases at SEPTA by 27%. This is largely due to the conversion of our diesel buses to now a nearly full fleet of hybrid electric buses, which are 30% more fuel efficient than the diesel fleet. And the emissions reductions that have come over the years from the regional electric grid. And SEPTA has the only fully electrified rail fleet in the country. And so we've been the beneficiary of those reductions. On the bottom, though, a very important point that we make at SEPTA is that the most sustainable thing that we believe anyone can do is mode shift, get people out of their cars and onto transit. And so we always try to normalize our greenhouse gas emissions on the basis of passenger miles traveled. And so the metric that we actually track is the basis of the top, which is the pounds of carbon dioxide divided by passenger miles traveled. we've seen good progress there, largely tracking our greenhouse gas emissions, our gross greenhouse gas emissions, although you'll note in the last couple of years that's sort of leveled off on a normalized basis, and that's because our ridership growth has flatlined over the last several years. And of course, as many of you can imagine, this metric isn't going to look quite so good when we track it next year because of the ridership losses associated with COVID. Next slide. So just a couple initiatives before I go into the solar initiatives that I wanted to highlight. We have some initiatives on our subway fleet, which are capturing energy and storing them in batteries at substations along our lines. This was actually written up as a sort of a nationally renowned innovation in the New York Times in 2016. We have the largest energy storage system in the country. We also have our first 25 battery electric buses are now running in South Philadelphia. 25, believe it or not, 25 is the second most of any transit agency in the country for this emerging technology. We're really excited about it because we've been able to gather a lot of data for how these buses do, particularly in the cold weather. Next slide. And then I think what we're here to talk about today is what we're doing to green our facilities. And so we've got a couple really exciting initiatives on the solar front that I'll give you some more detail on. The first is what I call our on-site rooftop solar installation. We have contracted with Con Edison to completely cover 4 of our maintenance facilities across Philadelphia. It really actually in most of the neighborhoods in Philadelphia. This one that's pictured here is in Feltonville. It's second in Wyoming. This is our largest bus maintenance facility. It's about just over a megawatt there pictured on our Barrage bus shop. But across the 4 maintenance facilities, the project is 3 megawatts and will generate 3,600 megawatt hours per year, which is about 25% of the total load of the 4 facilities. So it doesn't cover their complete load. We covered as many square feet of the roofs as we could, but those facilities are in operation 24/7. So there's a substantial load to cover. 2 of these are complete. One of them that's complete is pictured here, and 2 are still under construction. The economics for this project were roughly break even with what we were paying for our power from PECO and from our third-party commodity supplier. And it was a fixed rate with a 2.5% escalator for 20 years. We found that in our RFP process for competitive bids that this was the sort of the optimal point where the vendor could get their rate of return. The escalator was reasonable and the contract term was within the useful life of the panels. So that's why we went with fixed rate 2.5% for 20 years. Next slide. Also really exciting, and this contract was signed this spring, is what I'm calling an offsite utility scale solar project. And that project is contracted with Lightsource BP. This is a 35 megawatt project, so obviously much larger than the 3 megawatt rooftop installation. This will generate about 67,000 megawatt hours per year, which is about 20% of SEPTA's total electricity load. So whereas the previous project was 25% of the facility specific loads, this project will cover 20% of our entire electricity load. So that's really exciting. It's under construction right now with an expected delivery in late 2021. This was actually a fixed rate, and we were able to negotiate a 0% escalation rate for 20 years, which was really exciting. So we think we're going to see substantial cost savings in the back end of that 20-year project. But overall, on average, we're anticipating about $200,000 a year in cost savings on this one. And then we purchased the RECs in the quantity of the power produced. What we did with this one was we couldn't quite make the economics work to purchase the RECs from the project itself. So what we did was we did what was called a REC swap. So we allowed the vendor to keep the RECs to make the economics work from the project. And then we bought additional RECs in the quantity of the power produced. through the project. Next slide. And then the last solar initiative I want to talk about may not be directly applicable to everyone on the call, but I think it's really cool. So I thought it was worth talking about. Back when Hurricane Sandy happened in 2012, we were because we were in the Hurricane Sandy zone, we became eligible for federal funding in response to Hurricane Sandy. And we were lucky enough to get a large federal grant to do projects that in the Federal Transit Administration's words would help us be more resilient to the extreme weather from the impacts of climate change that we're seeing over and over and over again now. So FTA and the federal government did a pretty wise thing, and they said, we're not just going to pay you to recover from this storm, we're also going to pay you to make sure that its impacts don't happen over and over again. So one of the projects that we got was to make our regional rail power system more resilient in the face of this extreme weather. For those of you who rely on a regional rail system, you know, with a lot of these heavy storm events, sometimes trees can come down on our wires, they can knock the power out, and it can actually cause some significant delays throughout our system. And so what this project is we're actually going through our regional rail system and installing solar panels on the tops of our signal huts, which manage the signal system on our regional rail system, like you see pictured here on the Chestnut Hill West line. And inside the signal hut, we've installed a series of battery packs, which will allow for 48 hours of backup power in the event of a signal power failure. So we've installed these systems on our first pilot line on the Chestnut Hill West line in 2018, and we haven't had a single minute of signal power failures in the nearly 2 years since this project has been installed. Because essentially what we did was we localized the power feed to the signal hut so that the wires that operate the signal system along the lines are not the only source of power for the signal system. So we can keep the lines running. So we're very happy with the pilot on Chestnut Hill West. We're now working on the West Trenton, Warminster, and Lansdale-Doylestown lines with the ultimate goal of someday being able to afford and implement a full regional rail build out. And just a last note here that the project has been so successful that we're also considering at some point in the future making the solar plus battery power the primary source of power, which would provide, in addition to the resilience benefit of this project, the greenhouse gas benefits as well, because instead of using the pico power, you would be using the solar power. So that's all I have. Oh, that's right. We did add a lessons learned slide. So in the project prep conversation, we were sort of talking about, what are some of the things we could wrap up on? And I came up with a couple things. Going through these projects has been very complicated. These are new types of contracts for SEPTA. I mean, in one case you had a power purchase agreement. In another case, you had a virtual power purchase agreement, which was the 35 megawatt project. So developing the contractual model was very a challenging thing up front. And so my first two lessons learned and the things that I'd like to convey to anyone who's starting this process would be to understand exactly what you're looking for, to really think through the scope, and to make sure that those project objectives are accurately reflected in the contractual model that you suggest. So for us, a power purchase agreement made sense for the on-site project that's on, feeding the facility behind the meter, but it made more sense to do a virtual power purchase agreement for the off-site project because it made the settlement process with the vendor easier. Also, thoughtfully size your project for economies of scale. We learned a lot about some of the fixed costs versus the variable costs that go into what the vendors are producing on these projects. So, for us, the ability to bundle a bunch of different facilities together to make the project 3 megawatts instead of just 1 megawatt definitely got us a better project. Relatedly, understand the basis for your price to beat. We learned a lot through this project about how electricity is priced and how the various factors that go into electricity pricing relate to what the solar offering will or will not beat. And so I recommend understanding your utility bill before you go into a project like this. You understand the economics. Have a plan for what you want to do with the RECs. This became a major point of contention within SEPTA. As I mentioned earlier, SEPTA's fundamental sustainability objective is to move people as cheaply and efficiently as possible with a really low cost, low carbon transit system. And so we can't be spending a lot of extra money, operational dollars that we don't have, for additional pricing for things like RECs, but we still wanted to be able to provide the greenhouse gas benefits. So it became a very difficult conversation, because if you give up the RECs entirely, you give up the ability to claim any of the greenhouse gas benefits of the project. So over time, we were able to talk about different methods that we could make the project still economically work and keep the RECs. And that's how we came up with the REC swap concept. But that took a long time to get through the process of that. And then related to that, make sure you carefully message your project's benefits. There are very strict rules about what you can and can't say depending on what types of RECs you're buying. And so that becomes something that you need to consider along the way as well, so that you are not quote unquote greenwashing your projects. You're making sure that your project is accurately reflecting what you're saying it's doing. And that's all I have.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. That was a great summary of basically how a transit agency can use solar to serve three different purposes: offsetting on-site electricity needs, procuring to reduce the greenhouse gas impact of the overall organization, and then also a localized approach to improve the resilience of the system. So that was wonderful. Thank you. I see a couple questions actually coming in the Q&A box. And, I think in most webinars, we kind of save the Q&A till the end, but I know Eric has to jump a little bit early. So I'm going to actually field the questions for the SEPTA project now. So Eric, the first question that came across is, what happens after the 20-year PPA?
That's a great question. That was something that we spent a lot of time thinking about. And I don't know that we came to a great resolution, but we gave ourselves options. So we can essentially buy the panels from the vendor for, I think that the language we used was fair market value. Whatever the fair market value is considered to be of a panel that's depreciated over 20 years, or we can re-up the contract and keep it going, or we can tell the vendor to come in and take them away. So we included in the contract three different options for us, and it's SEPTA's sole decision which one we want to pursue. But that's a great question, because obviously our facilities have been around for 100 years, and we hope they're around for 100 more.
Right. Great. We got another question for you here about, can you explain more about the REC swap?
Yeah, so the RECs that come with the project are a commodity, just like the project is a commodity. And what we learned was, what the vendors do is that they build their pricing model for you to buy the power based on all of the various factors that go into the economics for these projects: federal incentives for solar, state incentives such as RECs, and then the price of their doing business plus a profit margin. And we could not make the economics of the project work without the vendor having the right to sell the RECs. So, but we also didn't want to just leave it at that, right? Because if you give the RECs to the vendor, then you're significantly reducing your ability to claim the environmental benefits of the project. So what we said was, okay, that if that's true, we want you to go out and buy us other RECs and the quantity of the volume produced. If you need these valuable RECs from this project to make the project pencil for us, you still have to give us additional RECs from somewhere else that make the project something that we can claim an environmental benefit from. So they ultimately gave us essentially cheaper RECs. they're still RECs, so we can still claim the greenhouse gas benefits of the project, but they're not the RECs directly from our project. So the environmental benefits that we can claim from the project are that without our contract, the project wouldn't be built. So literally there's additionality, 35 new megawatts of solar coming online because of our contract. Plus we can claim the acquisition of 35 megawatts worth of RECs.
Great, thank you. We've got a couple more questions for you here, and anybody else who has questions, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. I'll kind of run down them a little bit more. Next question is, what's the mechanism that allows a virtual PPA to exist for SEPTA? And could a C&I customer, a non-transit agency, do the same thing for a similarly sized project?
I'm not aware of any reason why a public or private sector entity couldn't do a virtual PPA. The only real difference between a virtual PPA and a physical a regular PPA is like, I don't know what to call it, the other type of PPA. The virtual PPA, the settlement mechanism is different. So in a virtual PPA, the contractual method that you purchase the power is essentially a price to beat. They give you a price, and then essentially instead of invoicing us for the power, what they're going to do is they're going to issue us a credit or a debit against that price to beat based on the market price that they can sell the power for. So it becomes easier because we don't have to figure out how to sleeve the acquisition of the power into our retail purchase of power, which, you know, the other 80% of our power, we didn't have to figure out the timing of it. We didn't have to figure out like exactly when, because you don't want to overbuy power, because then you have to sell that back into the market, and then it becomes a whole, you know, a whole financial issue. So it was just easier to go with this, you know, this sort of price to beat settlement structure. And again, they're not invoicing us for the power. They're basically going to build the project, sell the power into the market, sell the power into the grid, and then issue us either a credit or debit based on the market price compared to our quote unquote price to beat. And over 20 years, we expect that to be net positive for us for in about the tune of about $200,000 a year.
Great. One more question on the RECs. This question is about how Pennsylvania REC prices, you know, are considered somewhat cheap compared to other prices in the region. So where did the more affordable RECs come from in the REC swap structure?
You know, that's a good question. I'm not exactly sure where the new RECs were sourced from. I can get back to you on that. But I will say that Pennsylvania's REC market has significantly improved in the last couple of years from where it was, say, 3, 4, 5 years ago. They made some changes to the rules statewide, and it significantly increased the value of Pennsylvania's RECs. So I don't know. I don't know comparatively how Pennsylvania's RECs fare compared to other states. I mean, I know some states have significantly higher REC values than Pennsylvania, but I don't think Pennsylvania is as much of a laggard as it used to be in terms of the REC market. So it was definitely, the RECs were valuable enough that they were really actually crucial to the economics of the project. I'll say that. But one thing I do want to point out is that there have been some very interesting legal gymnastics going on around sort of how the economics of these projects, impacting the economics of the projects. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but pay very close attention to what's going on with FERC right now and what's going on between FERC and PJM, and how, you know, projects are or aren't going to be able to enter the capacity market, because the ability for these projects to generate revenue in the capacity market is one of the fundamental economic tenets for making these projects work. And there's a lot of things that are going on right now that are making a lot of the people in the solar industry very nervous. So we got our project in just before that became a major problem. But it was almost a major problem. I mean, it delayed our project for months while their general counsel was figuring out, is this a problem for us?
Interesting. Okay, I think we've got, let's see, one more question here for Eric, and then we'll move on to Matt's presentation. This is a kind of more broad SEPTA sustainability question, I believe. But does the Nicetown gas plant fit into your renewable energy plan?
Well, it fits into our resilience plan. The way I described the solar project on the signal huts, to keep the power running in the event of the extreme weather emergencies, that's how it fits in. And it also does reduce greenhouse gas emissions, so it fits into that aspect as well. Power resiliency is becoming one of the most significant vulnerabilities with the extreme weather that we're experiencing. And so we're spending a lot of time thinking about how can we keep our system running, and not just keep our system running, but how do we recover after these storms? Many of you probably lost power with the storms that came through, not even hurricane storms, just these cells that come through now. And it's incredible the impact that that's having on systems that are dependent on grid electricity. So.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much, Eric, for sharing all of this and sharing all of your knowledge. I think for any listeners on the call who are thinking about, figuring out a VPPA or on-site solar in the model that Eric has talked about here, one of the takeaways might be it's kind of complicated and there are a lot of moving parts. So, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at the Philadelphia Energy Authority, and we'll help connect you with some good resources to help you move forward on this front. Right now, I'd like to actually hand it over to Matt Handel from Alliance HSP. So Alliance HSP owns a multi-tenant building at 5th and Spring Garden in Philadelphia that just finished a solar installation. In fact, you can keep your eye out for some media on that later on today. Matt is the Director of Acquisitions and Leasing for Alliance Partners, and he worked very closely on the SONO solar project. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Matt, to discuss this project.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Go easy on me. I'm not a renewable energy expert. I'm going to give you my perspective on how a boring real estate development firm ended up getting to go green through through a grant from the Commonwealth and the leadership of the Energy Authority and great local vendor, Solar States. Next slide. For those of you that don't know the subject property, it's basically between 5th and 6th on Spring Garden, and it runs down to Willow Street, which is just north of Callow Hill. This was formerly the Destination Maternity distribution and corporate office space. In 2014, Destination Maternity moved to Southern New Jersey. They then elected to sell through a process with Jones Lang LaSalle. They elected to sell this real estate. We were able to buy it. It was zoned I-2, which allows you to do industrial and office by right. But most of the other interested parties thought that the viability for the site was really mixed use, which was part of the city's comp plan. So we sort of took a little bit of a gamble that there might be additional mixed use potential at the site, but we thought that we could make it work as either a sort of a creative office building or kind of a high-end light industrial building, given the existing bones. It was a 200,000 square foot facility, 24-foot clear. It's built in like the 70s for GlaxoSmithKline, predecessor to Glaxo. Had about 350 parking spaces on an 8-acre site. So there it is in all its beauty when we bought it. Next slide. Again, this was just marketing flyer we put together. Some of you might remember we tried a lot of different concepts. We went with a really high-end creative office concept. This sort of just plain vanilla industrial, trying to see what kind of fish we might catch. Actually, it was this flyer that led to our first 2 tenants. If you go to the next slide, They were sort of our first two tours. Yards Brewery, which was located on Delaware Ave in about 40,000 feet. They were growing. They needed a new facility. They had some unique requirements. They wanted to be close to downtown, visible, high-end industrial building, parking spaces, outdoor space for a beer garden. We happen to have it all. And while we didn't initially make a deal with them, we came to our senses eventually and decided that they were the right anchor tenant for the project. And right behind them was another tenant we toured early on. The city had been storing their archives over in University City in a building that Drexel and Brandywine have now redeveloped. And so they needed to get out, and they needed a high-end air-conditioned facility. And a little bit like Yards, they wanted to have some visibility for customers. In their case, customers are really people who would come and go to the archives to look at, documents, whether they were really historic or just things that were related to their own personal sort of history in Philadelphia, like i.e. a deed. And so we were able to lease them space right next to Yards. Both of those spaces were about 70,000 square feet. And the final piece of the puzzle, facing the large parking lot, was the largest urban format Target in the city, just under 50,000 square feet. So that process, kind of 2015 all the way up through 2018. Next slide. The next phase of the project, if you look down at the corner of 5th and Willow, is a mixed use building, because again, the city's zoning did change, and they did allow residential as a by right use. We're a first mover in that pocket of the city. So if you think of kind of 9th and Spring Garden all the way to 2nd and Spring Garden, most of it's office and industrial. There's a couple of residential projects, but they're adaptive reuse. This is the first ground up residential that we had planned. And somewhere around that time, that project, just by the way, is under construction now. We'll deliver next year, kind of sort of around June or July. 48 units and 11,000 feet of ground floor retail. If you go to the next slide, this was sort of probably 2018, and this is when Solar States enters the picture. They are based up in Old Kensington. Micah and Todd. Micah lives in Northern Liberties, and I think I'd be fair to say they were sort of lusting after our rooftop. Look at that beautiful roof. I don't think of it like that. I think of it as a roof that we have to maintain for our tenants. But solar guys, they look at it as a landing spot for a PV installation. And so Micah kept trying to contact me, and I don't know if I was giving him if I was dodging him. I can't really remember. But his closing move, which I think is brilliant, he sent flowers to our accounting department. And he said, "Will you please accept these flowers and tell Matt Handel to call me back about the solar project?" And so I called him immediately. I mean, I'm at, like as Mary Rose said, I'm in leasing and acquisition, so I'm kind of in sales. I thought, wow, this guy is pretty creative. He must have something up his sleeve. And so, sure enough, we started kind of looking at the economics of what solar might look like on that roof. And the tough thing for a private developer is the economics. You start talking about 20-year, 25-year, paybacks, SRECs, federal credits. They don't really line up normally with a opportunistic real estate investment, which is what we had. We bought an empty building. Our investors had a certain kind of return they expected. That's different from the kind of return you can generate through solar energy. So we sort of said, hey, this doesn't really work for us. Unfortunately, I know the roof works. We didn't really want to do a PPA. We had experience with them from other projects. We wanted to just own kind of the whole property with one ownership entity. And then the Commonwealth grant was introduced to us, and the Solar States team thought that because of what was happening, with the Energy Authority and our project, and the fact that we had the city use and Yards, which is kind of a hometown hero, we had a really good story and a chance to do something really impactful. So next slide. That's what it looks like today. And I'll just give you some of the sort of bullet point numbers. Cost about 1.5 million. The grant was for roughly $450,000. That meant that the state level SRECs got assigned to the Commonwealth, so you don't get to double dip. 8 jobs were created as part of the installation. 6 were maintained. Not exactly sure about the nuances of that, but that's those from Solar States. And just interesting enough, if you look at that roof, you can see the Target roof. So Target's roof, again, 50,000 feet, almost 100% covered in panels. Target, we were not able to come to terms with Target on a sort of fixed purchase rate that we needed to create the returns for our investors. So ironically, despite the fact that Target has this amazing sustainability kind of initiative, they have a ton of solar on their facilities around the country. We couldn't, the 2 parties couldn't make it work, but not contentious, just the reality of the situation. Yards, you can see it covers their roof as well, and they agreed to buy the power. And then the city bought the power, but didn't want the panels on their roof because of perceived risk associated with the archives. So just kind of a funny example of why, different priorities for different tenants can impact one of these projects. Roughly, we did a sort of a gross initial purchase of the power at about 6 cents per kilowatt hour, with us owning the R&M going forward, and a 2.5% escalator. Another thing is, you think about the useful life of one of these systems. We don't have, our leases expire before the end of the useful life. So it's hard to marry up a lease with a solar, kind of useful life. So, there's sort of an unknown about what happens in the future. Obviously, we hope all our tenants stay forever. But, we kind of had to look at it as sort of a 10-year program because of their roughly 10 years, because of the length of their lease term. Roughly, basically splitting up the energy produced 50-50 between the city and yards. And our estimates are about 40% of their consumption will then be covered, electric consumption will be covered by the solar created on the roof. 2,000 panels. It's a 900,000 kWh system. And these are just fun bullets at the end here. I think what we've got on our roof represents 71,000 gallons of gas that wouldn't be used, or 700,000 pounds of coal, if that's what was being used to create the electricity, or 1,400 barrels of oil. So, pretty big numbers, pretty cool. Again, this project doesn't happen without, the sort of the state and local leadership on prioritizing this. And then, really Solar States, with their just pursuit of the project. It's, I think it's a really cool, it's very visible. We're super proud of it. It's, a really interesting component to this project that we've been working on for a number of years. So yeah, that is, please, no technical questions. But that's the overview.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt. So kind of continuing with the format that we had a little bit earlier where Eric presented and we asked him questions. Actually, Councilmember Green's getting called away in just a few minutes. So if anyone has any questions for him, I'd like to field those questions now and then ask Matt any questions that you may have about the SONO project before we move on to our third case study. Councilmember, we did have one question come in for you so far, and that's what kind of policies would help support and grow the commercial solar market in the city in the future?
Mary Rose, thank you for that question. And as I was listening to Matt and the project, and one of the challenges of why we needed CPACE is that people were not really getting the benefit of doing solar projects because many entities would transition before they would get that investment back. And so that's one of the real benefits for CPACE. And so it's still very new, so it's somewhat difficult to identify what additional policies. But as I was listening to the conversation, one thing that struck me was how could we take the existing legislation and make it a little easier? And I'm also reflecting on so many people that came to that information gathering that we had last year. They were really intrigued about CPACE, but they were like, well, let's see who goes first. So maybe one aspect to that is in the permitting and other licensing that goes along with some of these construction projects. If there's a way of prioritizing that to give people kind of more expedited and quicker review, so that we're saying, okay, you can not only benefit by the CPACE legislation in reference to getting that return on that investment, but also all of the normal process issues that you have to go through for permits and other licensing with the city of Philadelphia as a way of expediting that. So maybe that's one more way of saying, listen, here I have a house, I have a commercial building. We need to make some improvements. There's a way we can make savings. And on top of that, I can expedite the permitting process in order to get things done even quicker. Maybe that's one way that we can make some additional policy changes that do not take a lot of legislative work. It's just working within existing branches in the executive part of the city that can provide that additional incentive that could move people to doing even more CPACE projects in the city.
Wonderful, thank you. That actually relates to some great progress made at the end of last year around the building permit fees related to rooftop solar for commercial installations in the city, getting those fees capped starting around $200 instead of the previous uncapped tens of thousands of dollars that projects could incur. So,
and also just capturing all that information, because sometimes those who are in business don't know about all these different changes. So we're able to take the capping, maybe expediting some of the permitting, CPACE, and put it into a document or some type of marketing piece so people can see all of that and continue to educate people about the benefits of this legislation and how they also can do good for the environment and also reduce energy costs. That's another way we can adopt some additional policies to make it easier for more commercial solar projects in the city of Philadelphia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions coming in right now. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
We appreciate you joining and have a great day.
Always a pleasure. Thank you and take care.
Thanks. We did have a question come in from Matt just now, which is about how big the array on the Yards and Target building, how big the array is in terms of megawatts on each part. You may have mentioned that, but the question came in.
Ooh. I don't know that. So Yards is, it's funny, Yards and the city are both kind of sort of 70,000 square feet, and Target is 50. I'm just using round numbers. So if you sort of took that percentage, and you thought that, I think it's pretty close that Target and Yards are essentially fully covered minus some special equipment they have on the roof. Mm-hmm. That's about the ratio, kind of 5/7, being, I'm sorry, 50.
5/7 split.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I would just say, listening to Councilman there, I think one of the things that's if you just take a step back and you think about the city, you know, most of our buildings in the kind of core or the extended core, you know, they're mixed use, they're multi-story. When you start taking a building that's 100,000 square feet, it's 5 stories, you have a 20,000 square foot roof, right? Solar doesn't, it becomes really hard for it to move the needle on the consumption in that building. You know, so I would, from a policy standpoint, I would focus on these kind of buildings because that's where you can really move the needle. And so trying to, you know, right now there's a lot in the press on, you know, development related to industrial, wanting to be closer to city centers. And that's happening in Philadelphia. And if I could pick one asset class to really move the needle, I would focus on incentives for industrial development, new construction, because that's what you want. You want a roof with a 20-year warranty that marries up with the solar installation, right? And you want all new energy efficient, you know, LED lights like that. Those kind of projects are your best chance, you know, because they're like our building. They're 300,000, 400,000, some cases 1 million square feet at these facilities. So, you know, that's where I would focus because I think that's an opportunity.
Yeah, that's great. And, you know, last mile e-commerce is obviously a huge trend in a lot of cities and urban areas these days. So that I'm sure we'll see more and more of that. That actually relates to another question that we had come in, which is, you know, in sort of the course of designing, constructing, or acquiring or leasing up a building, sort of through the life cycle of when you work on a building, what's the optimal point in time to start considering a solar project to help it move forward?
Wow. Well, that's a great question. It's tough to do it on true spec, right? You know, to just put the panels up there and kind of hope you get a tenant. Although that would help the most with marketability, right? If there were companies that, you know, for example, yards or the city, and we had the solar up there, that would have helped with the negotiations. But putting up one of those systems for $1 million+ and having it sit there dormant for potentially a year or two if you don't get time you're leasing would be hard, I think, for any investor. So probably the best thing to do would be to do some pre-con upfront, you know, as part of the acquisition, and be able to tell a tenant specifically as part of your negotiation of a lease, hey, look, here's what we can do if you want this. This is what the added rent would be, or this is what we would need you to, you know, to buy the energy from us for, because, you know, normally when the leases are signed, it's kind of too late. This was just a situation where we happened to have, you know, 2 awesome tenants that were here. They were committed for in excess of 10 years, and this aligned with their objectives. But normally it's kind of like, well, we already signed the lease and we don't really want to modify, and why are we doing this? And so that's the sweet spot, is if you could be there and be able to pitch it to a tenant and get them to sign on board, that allowed you to, you know, finance it as part of the tenant improvements. That's really would be the ideal for a project like this.
Great. That makes a whole lot of sense. So basically pre-lease tenant negotiations, bringing this up as an option sounds like a sweet spot for you.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I don't see any other questions for you right now, Matt. So you dodged any technical questions, but Eric's still on, so don't worry. We could have thrown them his way. If anybody else has any questions, we'll also have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. But right now, thank you, Matt, for everything that you covered. I'm actually going to turn the floor over to myself to talk about our third case study today. I'll be talking about a solar project on a daycare in Germantown that used C-PACE financing. Actually, we just announced this project 2 days ago as part of Solar Week. And this deal just closed earlier this month. So I'm excited to talk to you all about it today. Next slide, please. So before we get into the specific project, I just kind of want to do a high-level overview of what is CPACE. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, CPACE stands for Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy. It's a financing tool that provides long-term funding for 3 different types of projects: energy efficiency, water conservation, and clean energy projects. So the project I'll be talking about today is obviously a clean energy project because it's a rooftop solar installation. All CPACE projects have to create measurable savings on the energy side or the water usage side. And the thing that really makes it stand out as a unique financing tool is that it's done through a special assessment. So the repayment is made through a special assessment similar to a property tax assessment on the property. Next slide. So a couple things that really make CPACE special. And we have a lot more information on this online, so I'm just going to kind of go over the really high level points right here. First, as I just mentioned, CPACE is assessment-based financing, so that comes along with 2 really key benefits. The first is that the repayment obligation of a CPACE financing actually transfers with the property in the event of the sale. So this relates to something that actually Councilmember Green and Matt were talking about earlier, which is trying to match up payback period of the energy project. Oh, Matt, I think you need to go on mute. Okay, there we go. Trying to match up basically the payback period of a renewable energy project with the hold period and return period that a building owner might be looking for. So this assessment-based financing kind of facilitates that. Another benefit of being assessment-based is that in a lot of lease forms, like triple net leases, where a building owner can pass through the utility bill and property taxes to the tenants, the CPACE repayment obligations also pass through. So that kind of helps line up some incentives regarding utility bill payments and the savings you achieve from a CPACE project and the repayment obligation of a CPACE project. Few other things on CPACE to mention. So CPACE is long-term financing available for up to 30 years, but based on kind of the useful life of the equipment that's being installed. Solar has a really long useful life. As you guys know, the project I'll be talking about here did a 25-year term. And CPACE generally has very competitive rates around the 5 to 7% range. So it's not the cheapest debt out there, but it's a really solid alternative to mezzanine debt, preferred equity, and straight up cash for a number of businesses. Finally, CPACE can cover 100% of the hard and soft costs needed for a project to be installed, which basically limits the amount of upfront cash that has to be paid out of pocket for an energy efficiency project or a solar project or something like that. And as a result of the fact that most of these projects generate a lot of savings on the utility bill, a lot of time the project savings actually outstrip the repayment amount, creating net positive cash flow on an annual basis from year 1 for the property owner. So that's actually what we're going to see in this case study today. Next slide. So the Old City Day School in Germantown is one of 3 tenants in a building that just entered into a CPACE financing agreement to install 212 kilowatts of solar on the roof. The financing amount for CPACE covered all of the hard costs of the installation and the soft costs associated with the financing, the design, the engineering, and any legal fees associated with doing the project. So the total financing cost came to around $520,000. And the building owner basically entered into a 25-year repayment, 25-year financing agreement to repay that financing amount. The great thing about this project is that the rooftop installation of the 212 kilowatts of solar actually offsets almost 100% of the tenant's electricity needs, significantly reducing the carbon footprint of the building by almost 7,000 metric tons over the course of the life of the project. One thing that's really noteworthy here that I'd like to point out is that the economics of this project worked without any grants or subsidies. So the cost savings achieved by generating solar power on site, plus the tax benefits of the ITC and the depreciation, plus the benefit of SREC sales in the future, all contributed to a positive cash flow outlook for the owner. Those things combined with the fact that they were able to spread out the financing repayment over 25 years to reduce the annual amount due because of the way CPACE is structured, actually allowed the project to be cash flow positive. So it's a great success story for CPACE, and it's a great example of how commercial building owners in the city can look at solar as, you know, positive impact to their community, positive impact to their utility bill, and positive impact to their cash position over time. Next slide. So the Philadelphia Energy Authority, we run the Philadelphia CPACE program, and you can learn a lot more about us at philadelphiacpace.org. This is a snapshot of our website. We have a ton of information up there for all the different types of people who can participate in CPACE, including property owners, capital providers, engineers, etc. You can also feel free to reach out to us with any questions on that front. Great. So that concludes kind of our third case study of this presentation. I'd like to now take a few minutes to open up the floor for any questions. I'm going to check here and see if any have come in while I've been talking. Oh, okay. We have a couple more questions that have come in for you, Matt, if you're still with us.
I'm here.
Okay, excellent. So one question for you on your multi-tenant building is, how do you bill for electricity? Does this mean that the city and yards pay differently from Target?
Yeah, so all three of our tenants are we're already sub-metered. So really it's just accounting behind the scenes, right? There's the consumption that happens from all three tenants that feeds into the meters, and that's what we need to charge them. And then for Target, they pay the Pico rate. That's just what they pay, and the yards and the archives, city archives, pay us the predetermined rate, and then we scrape the VIG between what they're paying us and what the actual power is costing to produce, right? And that's our payback. So yeah, it's a little, it sounds more complicated than it is as it was once we kind of understood, and that's something that Solar States handles, but it's really it's just debits and credits and applying different rates based on what's Pico charging us and what is what we're charging the two tenants that participated in solar.
Great. We have two similar questions that just came in for you as well. So Matt, is this kind of work something that Alliance HSP is thinking about doing for other properties? And are you working on any other big projects?
Look, I mean, we're thrilled with the outcome here. As I sort of, it really does take, at the property level, it takes kind of two to tango. It takes the tenant and the landlord to be committed. And then there's sort of the financial feasibility, which, seems like you need help from either state or local, agencies to make it happen. So, we had a project, unfortunately a victim of COVID. We had a lease on another warehouse building out in Roxborough. It's 130,000 feet. We leased it to another brewery called Night Shift from Boston. Again, a long-term lease, a company that cared about sustainability. I think if we had gone forward with the project, which unfortunately we had to terminate back in March, I guess, or April, just because they weren't going to be able to make the project work. I think we would have been able to pull it off there. But again, that was really just probably more because of tenant driven. There, as I mentioned to you on our call maybe a couple of days ago, Prologis, which is like one of the biggest industrial owners in the world, they do solar on almost all of their buildings. But they're a publicly traded REIT with a really low cost of capital. And so it sort of just fits in with this long-term hold, that is typical for them. And as I mentioned, for us, normally a lot of times with these projects, when we create the value, we either sell or refinance, and so it makes it tricky. This was a situation where actually we funded our portion of the cost of installation as part of a refinancing. So even though we'd already done the leases, we were able to, because we were already working with lenders on what a refinance would look like, we were able to weave this into that. That was the right time. If we had just done our refinancing, it would have made it really hard to pull this project off, because you probably would have had to fund it all equity or like pay off the loan and put a new loan on. So it would have been like cost prohibitive. So I hope we get to do it again. I live right up the street, so I'm super proud of it. And I know that the Yards folks are really pumped that, that they get to sort of talk about this, that, they're an urban brewery and they're committed to the city. And by the way, they're buying green energy, right from their roof. So yeah.
Great. We've actually had a couple questions coming for you on the chat. I don't know if you can see them as well, but one of the questions here is, do you think that the grant that you got from the state was key for the project because of the 10-year term required based on the leases? And how do you think CPACE, which could have been a longer term financing with an assessment-based benefit that transfers in the event of a sale of the property, how do you think CPACE could have impacted the way this project penciled if the grant had been lower or there hadn't been a grant?
Yeah, I mean, look, the grant made it happen, and I think, like I said, I think we had a good, we had a good story for the grant, right? With the tenants that we had and where the building was. So, and the fact that the tenants were committed long-term. So there was real, like, it all lined up, which is rare. I'd be interested to sort of compare the CPACE program and really look at, capital upfront and payback and sort of how it would all work. I would imagine the same thing. It would have probably been if we were doing the CPACE before we refinanced. I guess we probably could have figured out how to do that, but it might have been tricky with our lender to, basically have another lien on the property post refinancing. So I don't know. It sounds like an interesting program. Yeah, love to talk to you more about it and try to see if just kind of compare it to this, like at the highest level. Hey, project was 1.5 million. You'd fund all of that. Here's the interest rate, and then I wasn't quite as up to speed on how it sort of transfers and who's paying that interest rate, right? That was what I wasn't quite following, but again, I was kind of multitasking a little bit, so sorry, call me.
Well, that's one thing that we see is really popular with CPACE right now, especially is kind of including CPACE in refinancings of buildings so that you're sort of, lining up all of your capital at one time. And we're also seeing CPACE as a really popular source of funds for new construction projects and gut rehabs that are, similarly lining up senior debt, maybe mezz. They'll bring in CPACE to offset that, some equity all at the same time, so they can really run the numbers together. Something I'd love to talk to you more about, Matt, but that's something, I think our attendees benefit from knowing as well, as if you're, CPACE can apply to retrofit projects, to projects that are undergoing major changes, and to ground up new construction as well. So it'd be very helpful. We did have another question come in, actually. What about the Frankfurt Arsenal? Emily notes that Oatly loves sustainability. So I don't know if you thought about that, Matt.
Yeah, look, maybe there's an opportunity there. That project is complicated in that it's a condominium structure. So we actually buy our power from the condo association, and it's it's a little tricky. But yes, the Oatly folks already asked me where their electric charging, car station was going to be, and said it's coming soon. It's in the mail. So yeah, they'll push us. They'll make us greener, which is good.
That's great. I'm glad to hear it. I see a couple questions coming in on CPACE, so I'll field those. And if anybody else has any questions for Matt in the meantime, feel free to type them in the Q&A or chat boxes. So I guess, one of the CPACE questions I saw here is CPACE available for nonprofits? Yes, it is. Despite the fact that, I mentioned it's an assessment-based financing that shows up as an assessment like a property tax assessment. Yes, nonprofits can use CPACE. And there's another question here about, what's sort of the application process for going through with a CPACE project. And I'm so glad someone asked that question. So we, as the Philadelphia Energy Authority, we're the program administrator. And so our job is to basically promote and support the program and facilitate applications going through the process to get to the point of being able to finance. So we have a two-stage application process, a pre-application. It's just a couple pages. It's super short, doesn't take much time to fill out, doesn't take much time for us to review, but we do require it to make sure that any projects that are moving forward with CPACE are eligible before they spend the time and resources to figure out the project in more detail. So for that, we really just screen, hey, is the property in Philadelphia? Are you looking at a project of a minimum size of about $100,000? And are you looking at a project in one of those three buckets, energy efficiency, water conservation, or renewable or clean energy, like this solar project? And then the property owners go through the process of really solidifying the design of the project that they want to put onto their building, getting an engineering survey, getting consent from any mortgage holders that they have on the property already, and then submitting a final application, which is longer and has, the requirement of this energy survey that describes the baseline energy and water usage compared to the projected energy and water usage after the CPACE project installation, among some other things. And then we, the Philadelphia Energy Authority, review that. Once we approve the final application, we enter into an assessment agreement between the property owner, which is the borrower, the capital provider, which provides the financing for CPACE. We have about 20 active capital providers in our market. Most of them participate in other CPACE markets nationwide and are very experienced in doing this type of work. So those two parties, along with PEA and the city, enter into an assessment agreement. As soon as we sign that agreement, you close the financing, you get your money, you move forward with your project. We have a lot more information on that on philadelphiacpace.org. And I love talking to people about CPACE and their CPACE projects. So if you have any questions, you can always feel free to reach out to me at cpace@philaenergy.org. You can also get me through the Solarize website, which is solarize@philaenergy.org. A couple other questions came in on CPACE actually. So on the specific case study that we just talked about with Old City Day School, there's a question about who the lender was. It was Greenworks Lending. They're a nationwide CPACE capital provider, and they've done a number of projects throughout the country. And this was actually their first project in Pennsylvania. This solar project is actually the second project in Pennsylvania financed with CPACE at all. The first project in Pennsylvania to use CPACE was also in Philadelphia. It was for a mixed-use building in Kensington. And then we have another question here about the prospects of RPACE for homeowners. So CPACE, stands for Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy. It does not include any residential buildings, and it does not include multifamily buildings. And we don't anticipate residential PACE being considered or added to any sort of PACE legislation in the state. Let's see, any other questions here? Another question here on CPACE. Have there ever been any issues getting permission from mortgage holders? And what are the credit requirements for the organization? So great question. So CPACE takes a first and prior lien position because of its assessment-based nature. So it does, the CPACE payment obligation each year does come before the mortgage payment obligation, which means that before you can close a CPACE financing, you have to get consent from your mortgage holders if you have any on the building. That is a process that requires some education with some mortgage holders. However, one of the benefits, Pennsylvania is one of the later states to adopt CPACE. And there are 35 states that adopted it before Pennsylvania did. So a lot of other states have sort of already done that grunt work, working with a number of nationwide lenders and even lenders who work here locally to secure mortgage consent and educate them on CPACE. In fact, we have a list of over 200 financial institutions that have already provided consent on CPACE financings to deals either in our area or across the country. So yes, that does require a conversation and some education with some financial institutions, but for the most part, there's been a ton of success there. In fact, through 2019, over $1.5 billion dollars have been deployed in CPACE, all receiving mortgage holder consent. And the question about credit requirements for the organization, that'll really depend on the underwriting process of the capital provider. We at PEA as program administrator, we have certain requirements about lien to value and tax status of the organization, but the actual credit worthiness is assessed as part of the financial underwriting done by the capital provider. Let's see. So we have here a question from Matt. Matt, if the vendor didn't send flowers, would this project never have happened? Curious about this from the standpoint of the vendor of, what happened in the initial conversation that made you consider moving forward to explore solar on the building? So aside from the flowers, what really hooked your attention once you did talk to solar states to truly consider putting solar on your roof?
Yeah, look, they were obviously super knowledgeable and were willing to put in some upfront work on trying to model, sort of what the yield would look like and what the upfront capital cost would be. And I think their first sort of can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Sorry, I had my phone on, put it back on airplane mode. I think initially they were pitching us on a PPA. So sort of like, hey, you have a great roof. Let's tell you how you can monetize it. And that's how the conversation started. And I think our feedback was we actually tried to do that at another project with a different tenant in way back when, probably 5 years ago. We said, we don't love the complications that come with having a third party own something on your roof. So really not that interested in that. And then sort of the grant entered the picture. And I'll just give you a second kind of interesting solar experience for us from a commercial property standpoint as relates to a third party ownership. We own a property out in Fort Washington. Again, former kind of actually a pharma production facility that kind of got converted to Class B office. And the previous owner had installed solar and owned it in a separate entity, right? That was paying, essentially he was being paid back by the property. He lost the property to the lender, but then he still owned the solar field. And now, 10 years later, there's potential for mixed use on that site, maybe some residential. And so it became kind of funky, right? Because this guy who was long gone sort of controlled some of your development rights. So we ended up buying out him from his, solar entity so that we could control the whole property. Because it was just sort of a headache. Not to say that PPAs are a bad idea, just sort of something that it complicates things, when you have another decision maker and your roof is important. If you want to knock a building down and build up, well, the roof is there. So you need to talk to them. if your tenant wants to do something on the roof, you need to talk to them. So this way, you know, when the project evolved, it was appealing to us because we knew that, look, at the end of the day, you know, we funded it, we own it, you know, we can move it around if we need to. You know, it's just a lot more flexibility. So, yeah, but send flowers. Don't send cold emails. Send flowers. It's a good tool.
That's a great lesson. I haven't heard that one before.
Yep.
I like it. So I see one more question here on CPACE, and I'll ask it in just a second. But if anybody else has any questions for me or for Matt, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box or the chat box. The last question that I see right now is about EV chargers, and if EV chargers are going to be added as a CPACE eligible measure anytime soon. And right now, unfortunately, EV chargers are not eligible for CPACE because the state legislation's pretty clear that any energy project that's funded with CPACE has to create energy savings. And though EV chargers obviously have fantastic sustainability component, they don't technically fall within the way that the state legislation is written for CPACE. So they're not eligible right now, and I don't have a sense of if they're going to be added at any time in the future. But thank you for the question. I hope that a lot of people are considering EV chargers at their buildings because they're a fantastic way to have an impact on your customers and employees' sustainability. Let's see. I don't see any other questions coming in, so I want to just wrap up by thanking you all so much for your time and your engaging questions. We had a lot more of a wide, spanning conversation than I was expecting today, and I'm so pleased that so many people were so engaged. If you have any questions about how your home or your business can go solar, please reach out to us at solarize@philaenergy.org. And if you have any questions about CPACE, please feel free to reach out to us at the Solarize email address or at cpace@philaenergy.org. This is the second annual Philadelphia Solar Week. Later on today, we've got two more programming events for you. We've got CPACE plus solar open office hours. So if you have any other questions about how you can use CPACE financing, feel free to schedule some time. I will be available to answer any questions during that time. And then we also have a virtual home tour for rooftop solar installations on some homes throughout the city. So that should be really exciting. We're seeing some very cool projects that way. So check that out. You can find all of this information on solarizephilly.org. A couple other plugs for you here. Tomorrow is actually a big culminating day for Solar Week. And in the afternoon, we have a really exciting event where we're graduating the students who have gone through Philadelphia Energy Authority's Bright Solar Futures program. So these are high school students who have been training to take on solar jobs, and we'll be graduating them and then featuring a career panel on how to move forward in the solar industry with these jobs. And we'll be hearing a keynote speech from Laura Bean, the Chief Renewables Officer of NG Renewables. So that should be very exciting. And finally, Councilmember Green actually joined the Yo Sun podcast with Solar States earlier this week to discuss his view on solar and a lot more throughout the city. You can find the interview on solar-states.com or wherever you listen to your podcasts. So thank you all again very much for joining. Really appreciated your time today. Look forward to seeing you at more events this week. Have a good one.